In 1998, when I was being interviewed to be director at Delta, for Delta.com, the person that interviewed me was talking about leadership and asked me to identify 3 of my heroes. And I thought, and I said, well, being an Englishman, I would say Winston Churchill. Being an IT person, I would say Bill Gates. And being a travel person, and I gave the name of our next speaker. And it's with personal pleasure for me to say, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Bob Crandall.
And hello to everybody, and hello to you, and welcome to Gloucester.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Crandall. So the last time, at least I heard, when you left AMR, you were going to sail your boat. Did you ever do anything?
Well, it's right out there in the harbor. When I retired in 1998, Jan and I had bought an English sailboat, an Oyster. And so we did the annual meeting, put down the gavel, went out to the airport, got on the airplane, flew to England, and sailed the boat back across the Atlantic, which was a great adventure. Which took us, matter of fact, we had some of the people in the audience will remember, we had a sort of a lottery. We said, you can buy a ticket, right, as to our probable date of arrival, and however much money gets raised, Jan and I will match it. And I've forgotten what it was, but I think we raised $10,000 or $12,000, and Jan and I matched that, so and we had an appropriate charity. The problem is it took us so long, nobody won. Because it took us 28 days to sail it, wow. But we had another 28 days in the Azores being repaired. So the fact is, it was a great adventure, and we've used the boat, had a lot of fun with it, and we've just replaced it, as a matter of fact, with a catamaran, which is better for using in Florida, which is where we now spend the winter. So we've had a nice 10 years, and it's hard to believe that 10 years ago, I just got an email from a friend of mine recalling that 10 years ago, yesterday or the day before, he was standing on the ramp watching us fly away. So it's really been quite astonishing that life goes by at a far quicker pace than you imagine.
It does. Speaking of great adventures, a lot of the audience probably won't remember too many of the details of how Sabre started out. Can you give us the Cliff Notes?
Well, I'll give you a Cliff Note version, sure. I mean, Max Hopper, I gather, talked to the group last year. And we had this goes way back into the late 60s and early 70s, and we had built Sabre, and there was an increasing pressure in the travel agent community to participate in automation. And I can't remember the exact date, but the fact of the matter is, in those days, of course, the travel agents were taking way too much of airline revenues. I expect that's probably still the case. In any event, the travel agents wanted automation. We had talked about beginning to put Sabre into travel agency locations. But we thought that the risk was that the travel agents might create their own system, which they were talking about doing with controlled data. So there was a meeting of the Travel Agent Association in Brazil. And Max and I flew down to Brazil, and we made a big pitch that why don't we do a joint system between the travel agents who would own half and the airlines that would own half. And we called it JICRS, Joint Industry Computerized Reservation System. And Max volunteered to run it, and we actually got it started, and I went to call on the presidents of all the airlines and got each of them to contribute capital. And so we started the process, actually did start the process of developing a joint system. And then United decided, and this was in the mid to late 70s, that Apollo was a better system than Sabre. But Max, of course, had been a very clever guy, and he and I had hatched up a plan that we were going to get Sabre ready just in case something went wrong. And so Sabre had made a number of modifications to the system, which made it superior from a travel agent's point of view to Apollo. So when United went off and announced that they were going to automate the agency industry, Sabre was ready. And it was funny because, we started to do this. Now, keep in mind, these are not big numbers by today's standards, but by those days it was. I got successive appropriations from the board for $100 million. We spent $100 million putting Sabre out into the agencies, before we started to realize any flow of revenues. And the rest of the airlines laughed at us. They said, "You guys are nuts." And so we offered to sell a share of Sabre to every other airline, and they all turned it down. And then by the late 1970s, after deregulation, of course, they woke up and they said, "Wow, these guys are getting a lot of share." Because in those days, you recall, we had preferential displays, so American was at the top of every screen.
Alphabetical.
Alphabetical. It was just alphabetical. Actually not. It was weighted, and perfectly, we were paying for it. Why not?
Right.
And then in 1980, if my memory serves me correctly, the airlines woke up and they said, "Holy mackerel, this is bad. We're losing a lot of share." They went to the Department of Transportation, and they said, you have to make these guys take away preferential display. And we said, well, that's kind of not a good idea because we're paying for this, but in any event, surely you'll let us charge a fee. And the Department of Transportation said, yes, you can charge a fee, and we did start it. If my memory serves again, the initial fee was $2.50. And on the day the first bills went out, Sabre became more profitable than American Airlines. And the rest of the airlines said, my God, what have we done? And it's, of course, been a process of constant development and change since then, and the GDS business today is very different than the Sabre business was in those days. But the kernel remains the same, right, which is very largely attributable to the technical skills of the people who are watching and their predecessors.
Talk about deregulation. You weren't a big fan.
No, and I'm still not. I mean, we've had 30 years of experience. In the intervening 30 years, the airlines have lost billions and billions of dollars. The U.S. domestic air transportation system is coming apart. Just this morning, I did a show with Good Morning America talking about Americans' initiative to begin to charge a fee for the first bag. And of course, that's not the issue. The issue is that the airline industry has been unable to price its product properly. The problem is not oil prices. The problem is that the airlines don't charge enough. And that is a consequence of very intense competition, way too many airlines, way too many hubs. And in order to control that, we've got to have some kind of regulation, I believe. Not the kind we had before, but I think there has to be some regulation. I think we need labor legislation. I think we need legislation about bankruptcies. I think we need regulation to prevent the airlines from scheduling more airplanes into an airport than it can handle. And I think we need some kind of sort of minimum price regulation because we don't want to destroy the domestic airline business. Right. So lots of water over the dam, lots of exciting times, both for the airlines and for you guys.
Do you think there's a chance it'll change, that they'll re-regulate?
I don't know whether there's a realistic chance of that or not. You know, there's an old saying that says, what cannot continue won't. And something's going to change. Either all the airlines are going to go bankrupt again, or the industry is somehow or the other going to find self-discipline so that it can recapture its costs, or we're going to have re-regulation. One of those three things is going to happen because the industry simply cannot sustain itself in its current circumstances.
One of the many things you were credited for was yield management, revenue management. And from what I've read in my past, it kind of dates back to your days at Hallmark.
Well, Hallmark was one of many formative ideas, but I worked at Hallmark from about 1963 to about 1969, and Hallmark had a great methodology. They would, every card store in America had a card rack, and in the card rack, you'd ship out cards 6 at a time. And in between the third and the fourth cards, there was a 51-column punch card. So when the third card was sold, the card store owner would pull out the punch card and send it to us. And back then, this was pretty revolutionary. We were using some operational research stuff, operations research algorithms, and we would look at the pattern of sales. And we said, now here, this guy just sent us a card, and that's a 4-line, Happy Birthday Dad, 25-cent card. But this card shop has been selling more expensive cards. I think he can stand a 35-cent card. So we go out in the warehouse and we take exactly the same card, which is printed on big 4x8 sheets, and it had everything on it but the price. run it through the presses and put 35 cents on it and send it out. And so you've got absolutely no change in your cost of goods, but you're charging more because the pattern of consumption said the customer was prepared to pay more. It had more value. So we looked at the airline business at the time and we said, why is every seat worth exactly the same price? It isn't. Obviously, on the last day, right, just before the airplane leaves, you have a choice. You can pay the full price or you can walk. Alternatively, because the airplane may be bigger than the amount of full fare traffic that you can generate, if you could sell some of it cheaper ahead of time, you would create a rubber airplane. And that's where the whole idea of yield management came from. And let's sell each seat for what it's worth at any particular moment in time. And of course, it has gotten immensely more sophisticated since then. But that was the underlying idea and remains the underlying idea. Sell it for what it's worth, not necessarily, and what it cost has nothing to do with that.
Right. And did you coin the frame bums in seats as well?
Well, we talked about bums in seats, sure. Of course, that's always been the name of the game in the airline business. But in the early days, the airlines had it wrong. I mean, in the 1960s, you could walk around in London, and there would be blackboards leaning up against the sides of buildings, which says, tickets available to the U.S. this afternoon, 50 pounds or whatever the number was at the time, which of course exact reverse. And what people would do is they'd buy a regular ticket and go out to the airport and say, have you got any of those 50-pound tickets left? And they'd say, well, sure. So the guy would buy one and he'd go home and refund the original full fare ticket. So they had it backwards. Right. You sell the cheap seats first, not last.
What do you miss the most about your days at airlines?
Oh, well, what I miss the most is the ability to collaborate with all the folks that are watching. I mean, you saw me this morning fiddling around with my grandson's Apple computer. I've always found technology enormously interesting, but I always had lots of people to learn from. I mean, Max, and we had this wonderful group of our mathematicians and statisticians who could do all kinds of magic things with models. And so I learned from those people every day. I suppose they learned from me to some extent, and I learned from them. And the one thing that you don't have in retirement is you don't have that asset. You don't have anybody to go to and say, what do you think about this? Right. Or how do you do this particular thing, X, Y, Z? So the absence of intellectual collaboration is the great failure of retirement. And which is why I've tried to stay active on different boards, because it gives me a chance to keep up to date with what's going on, to some modest extent with technology, and to a considerable extent with what's going on in corporate governance and business law and that kind of thing.
Looking back at Sabre then and now, I mean, one person that obviously our CEO, do you remember Sam Gilland?
Oh, yes, of course. As a matter of fact, I see Sam from time to time, talk to him every now and then. And he's been very nice to sort of keep me up to date in the general way that the industry is evolving, which of course is very different today than it was then, but that's simply a reflection of the different parties in the commercial chain pushing and pulling on each other as circumstances change.
One of the things I read too about the old history of the airline business was a thing called the Conquistadors de Cielo.
Yeah, Conquistadors de Cielo, conquerors of the sky. Well, Conquistadors started way long ago, back in the late 1930s. They had Charlie Fry from TWA and C.R. Smith from American, all the original airline guys, and they created an aviation business. For a long while. It was just the airlines, and then they brought in the manufacturers, and remains today a group of aviation executives, and they gather twice a year. Once a year they go to a resort somewhere, and once a year for what they call the ranch meeting, they go out to Charlie Gates's ranch in Wyoming. And it's kind of never been my thing, because the ranch has very limited accommodations. I decided a long time ago the only person I sleep with is Jan. So you have to share 4 or 5 guys sleep in one room, and they ride horses, and they draw guns and shoot buffalo guns. And that's not my kind of thing, but it has nonetheless been a fun gathering place over the years, very largely a social club. Right. but of people who like airplanes, who are fascinated by aviation.
Do they still meet?
Oh, yes. Yes, they just had their spring meeting, and when we go to the ranch years ago, I mean, Paul Thayer, who was very active in the business for a long time, and a great pilot, would fly upside down. And he'd buzz the camp, but he'd actually fly over it upside down, which is a sort of a feat of airmanship that I'd be hesitant to undertake.
You don't fly?
No, I've never been a pilot.
So what are you doing today? What are you doing right now?
Well, this morning we had 5 o'clock this morning, we had a TV crew here. I did a very brief piece with Good Morning America with respect to what's the matter with the airline business. I'm going to give a speech at the Wings Club in early June about what's the matter with the airline business. I'm on 2 private boards and 2 public boards. I just got retired off one public board because I'm now too old. I passed the 72-year-old threshold. But I try to stay active. I want to stay active. I much prefer work, if you call it that, to playing golf. And so I'm going to continue to make speeches and write articles and do consulting and participate in running anything where they'll let me have a shot at the controls.
And for the future, politics, would it ever attract you?
Politics doesn't work. It wouldn't work for me for a whole variety of reasons, but the most important is that you've got to go out and raise a lot of money. Right. And there's a lot of evidence out there that you simply cannot raise the money unless you are willing to speak things that are not the truth, and I'm not willing to do that.
And as far as the airline business, if somebody offered you a CEO position?
Oh, I suppose I'd do that, but there are 2 limitations. One is I wouldn't ever take an airline job where I'd compete with American. Right. And second, I think America's got a very competent leader, so I don't expect to get asked to replace him.
Mr. Crandall, I appreciate your time.
My pleasure.